Okay, I would like to welcome everybody to the Vancouver, Washington Institute of Noetic Sciences Community Group tonight. We have a wonderful program, a very intriguing program. I love the title. Our speaker is Paul Levy. He's from Portland, Oregon, and he is just a minute. Calls himself a wounded healer, and he has an organization called Waking in the Dream. He's written a number of books, including Undreaming Wetiko, which is about breaking the spell of the nightmare mind view. I love the title about the modern body snatchers. I had to break out laughing when I saw your title because it just so fits what I feel is happening right now. So, Paul, we're looking forward to your speech, and like to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invite. And yeah, when I titled the speech, Invasion of the Body Snatchers Comes to Life, I had just written an article. It's on my website titled exactly that. And we are in a time unlike any time in all of our lifetimes, in all of history. It is like we're in a sci-fi, like a Philip K. Dick sci-fi book and or film. And the last number of years, I've never personally seen anything like it, particularly around not being able to talk with people, not being able to have a back and forth dialogue where we both reflect and can come, even have a healthy debate and come to some sort of result or conclusion. That's become almost impossible in so many ways. And when I know people, I mean, families have split up or friendships have ended. And one way of understanding it is because people have gotten fixed in a viewpoint. Whatever that viewpoint is, whether it's right or wrong. And just that, the phenomena of being fixed in a viewpoint is itself something that's really interesting. Because one of the things I point out in my work is the incredible importance of cultivating what I call omniperspectival consciousness or awareness. And the idea is, think about a circle, instead of just being on one point on the circumference of the circle, and that's your viewpoint, to be able to entertain what's happening from as many points of view as are on that outside of the circle, hopefully 360. But if you're not able to do that, and if you get fixed in a viewpoint, and particularly, with all the propaganda, and I want to put out, this isn't, I'm not going to get political. I'm not going to be saying, oh, it's the left that are propaganda putting it out, or the right. No, it's everywhere. It's omnipresent. And it's so interesting, just the phenomena of when people, they'll hear a podcast, they'll read an article, they'll go to a fact-checking site, and they will just snap into a judgment, assuming that they're now in possession of the truth. And I'm sure what I'm describing, we've all run across many, many times. I know I do. I've had to develop what I call these don't go there zones with everybody. And I've learned, oh, this person I can't talk about Trump. This person I can't talk about Biden. This person I can't talk about Putin. This person I can't talk about the vaccine. It's unbelievable. We've never had to cultivate that ability to navigate, to figure out where are the edges where I feel safe to talk and where I better not, because the expense, the cost would be too much. And so what I inquired into in my latest article, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers Comes to Life, is just that process, like what is going on there. And from this one point of view, it's very, I think of the work of Jung, who a number of times in his writings, because I've been studying him for like 40 years, he's my, he really saved my life. When I was going through, I went through a really extreme state, that was a profound spiritual awakening. In case some of you don't know, I'm not going to go into the story, but in 1981, and I immediately got pathologized and hospitalized and diagnosed and medicated. And what saved me was that I knew that I was actually having an awakening. That couldn't have been made more clear to me. And then at a certain point, I began, after the hospitalizations, I was realizing, wow, instead of that being a mistake, that was actually part of my initiation. That was like sort of a shamanic descent into the underworld, because I never in a million years would have believed the insanity and the stupidity and the abuse that was getting enacted through the psychiatric system. And to go back to the work of Jung, Jung again and again points out that the human species has been possessed. Okay. And it has been possessed by the unconscious. And he actually says this time that we live in, even though he died in 61, it's like he's talking about today. He's saying this time that we live in is a peculiar time, in the sense that it's as if the unconscious has taken possession of our consciousness as a species. And it's like the unconscious is in the driver's seat of our vehicle and is driving us off a cliff. I mean, we're enacting collective suicide. That there's not a question about. But I find it interesting that he talks about that our species is possessed, because that really rings true to me with reference to this topic tonight about people, the invasion of the body snatchers thing. Because when people snap into a viewpoint, and keep in mind that the powers that be, that in a way they don't have our best interest at heart. I would debate that with anyone, but they have a different sort of motivation that's driving their behavior. And I would say it has to do with power and centralizing power and control. And it's not just in the Republicans or the Democrats, it's a global phenomena. And something is playing out on our planet through our species that actually is horrifying. It's a nightmare, and it's very frightening. And it's this revelation, okay? Hidden, encoded in the evil, in the insanity that's playing out, is a revelation. And that's in essence one of the most fundamental parts of my work. I talk about this mind virus, the Wetiko mind virus, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And I point out that if people get all edged out and it sounds woo and new agey about a mind virus, all that really means is that the source of our insanity, collective insanity, where we're actually destroying each other, is to be found within the psyche. Okay, that's what the idea of a mind virus means. And so, our species is possessed, some more than others. One way of thinking about it is that we've been identified unconsciously with the unconscious. And slowly, as a species, we are stepping out of the unconscious identification with our unconscious, and we're actually cultivating awareness. But some people aren't. And it's only really the cutting edge of people who are really doing inner work and self-reflecting and awakening to who they are, to who we are, just in relationship to each other, and to what the nature of our experiences and the nature of our world. Because I would point out again and again, and I will tonight, that you see, when I had my experience in 1981, that got me in trouble because I was so ecstatic at what I was realizing. And it all came out of incredible trauma. I was deeply in pain, deeply suffering. I don't need to go into the story, but the point is that I had this awakening, this spontaneous awakening. And what I had awakened to, at least in the beginning stages of, was that, oh my God, we're having a collectively shared dream. Each one of us are dream characters in each other's dreams. And just like when you have a dream at night with people in it, and you wake up in the morning and you recognize, oh my God, all the characters in the dreams were aspects of me. That's our situation in our waking dream, okay? That we're actually these reflective aspects of each other in embodied form, that we're not separate, that we're interdependent and interconnected. That's what I was realizing. And I was so ecstatic that, you know, I freaked out, what I call the anti-bliss patrol. In other words, I was too ecstatic for just normal mainstream, and they right away, you know, they locked me up. And within a minute, you know, of being locked up, I had an experience that changed my life. I won't go into that tonight. I think a lot of you probably know about that, where I met a blind woman in the hospital, and just by like interacting with her, her sight got restored, you know, within a minute. And you know, when that opened my eyes to like, what is going on? And that experience saved my life, because here the doctor is telling me, oh, you're mentally ill and you'll have this illness the rest of your life. And I'm just thinking, oh my God, they have like no idea. You know, so my whole body of work has come out of those initial experiences, because for that next almost 2 years, it was like I made a quantum jump from one world into another that looked exactly the same, except everything was different. And what was particularly different was what was possible in this new world I found myself in, that the realm of possibility expanded to almost an unimaginable degree. And it took me a dozen years of going to therapy and doing inner work and meeting my teachers and doing Buddhist practice and making art and connecting with my dreams and studying alchemy and shamanism and anything and everything that would help me to deal with the suffering that I was in. And that led me to find my work and myself, actually. Um, but going back, so that's just creating context. I'm not coming, you know, here as a scholar or an academic, you know, or, oh, I have like a PhD or whatever. No, there's none of that. What I'm talking about is coming from hard-won experience, that for over 40 years I've been 24/7 just trying to deal with what got shown to me, you know. And I'm slowly beginning to integrate, because it was so overwhelming, because it was like stuff began happening in my life that was physically impossible. And particularly when I was around my teachers, it was like there was like somehow the field around them just torqued or warped in a way that the rules of third dimensional space and time didn't hold sway. And, you know, at that, I was 24, 25. So I was so unprepared for what I was realizing. And I'm still a work in progress, just integrating, you know, what was being shown to me. But going back to what's happening in the world, it's so interesting. So I have, you know, I'm fortunate in that I have, you know, a really, you know, some close friends who I can talk to about anything, and we trip out on stuff together about what's happening, and we contemplate it symbolically like it's a dream, you know, and try to understand what is the meaning of this, what is it showing us, you know, what is it touching in ourselves. But then so many of my friends who are good, kind, incredibly smart, well-intentioned people have drank the Kool-Aid, and are just, from my point of view, without getting specific, they're under a spell. And it's so interesting, because part of them being under a spell, and it's exactly like being under a spell, like in a fairy tale, part of being under a spell is that they don't have any curiosity. Like if you were to reflect back, oh, well, actually, the viewpoint that you're espousing, there's another point of view that's just as credible, or even more so, that says the opposite. I'm just stunned, just again and again, at the lack of curiosity. And it's almost as if like another viewpoint that contradicts their view of the world is seen as a threat. And one way of understanding that is that they're not almost, they are identified with their person, with their belief. So if you take away their belief, it would threaten, you know, their very sense of self, almost like it's an existential threat. And so what I've learned is that, yeah, at a certain point, there's no talking. You can't like bring up evidence. And I'm imagining we've all experienced this in our own ways. You know, you bring up evidence, you'll bring up facts, and or you'll bring up stuff that creates a total cognitive dissonance in their worldview, and it just won't impact them at all. And of course, part of their trip is that they think they're in possession of the truth. And you know, and a lot of them are just, oh, because they've read the mainstream media, you know, so they've been propagandized. And it is such a trip. I mean, what do you do? You know, and I'm not that I'm necessarily going to give all of you guys answers, because I struggle with that every day. But I have some friends who only hang out with people who have their viewpoint, or who they're awake in a certain way, and other people who are awake. I'm actually really interested. I hang out with, I don't have those parameters. So a lot of people I hang out with, I feel are like really, you know, under the spell. And I'm really interested, you know, in what is happening to them, you know. And I see, it's like one of the quotes in the collected works Jung talks about. He goes, it makes no sense to preach the light to people whose eyes can't see. Okay, that it's a much better strategy to teach the art of seeing. Now, that connects me to my work, where I've written 3 books now on this mind virus, the Wetiko mind virus. And I'm not any sort of, you know, it's not my thing. I didn't discover it. I'm just a translator. This is a Native American term. You know, you can conceive of it as being a mind virus, but it's in every spiritual tradition. It was in the Bible, and it got edited out of, even though it's still in the Bible a lot. The main part of it got edited out of the Bible because the mind virus was on the editorial board, and it doesn't want to be exposed. So in the apocryphal text, they talk about the counterfeiting spirit, and this is precisely what the mind virus does. And if I could just describe that, because this connects with the theme for tonight. So, okay, the number one protection against or towards the mind virus is to be in touch with your nature, to be in touch with who you are. And you know, just to take a step back, that's such a cliche, like, oh, to be in touch with who we are. Well, who are we? I mean, that's the question that comes up in my mind. And I would point out, well, our nature, our true nature, Jung actually calls it our stellar nature. And I love that phrase, our stellar nature, is actually by its very nature creative. And so when you have realization of your nature, you just, in a natural way, embody and express yourself creatively. And the more you embody and express yourself creatively, the more you deepen your realization of your nature in a positive feedback loop that creates light upon light. Okay. So if you're in touch with your nature, when you know, all of a sudden there's propaganda, there's misinformation, there's lies, you're able to stay connected with yourself, and the possibility of you falling under the spell is very low. But if you're not in touch with your nature, keep in mind, this mind virus, it's actually, think of it as the counterfeiting spirit. So this counterfeiting spirit has no creativity at all, but it plugs into our creativity and turns it against us. Okay. And that's why, by the way, being creative, you know, and I'll be talking about this, I'm sure, before we end tonight, is like the medicine for Wetiko, for the mind virus. That to the extent that any of us or all of us can connect with our nature and express ourselves creatively, that is kryptonite to the mind virus. So here's how the mind virus works. As a counterfeiting spirit, it has no creativity, but it's a master impersonator. It puts us on. And by putting us on, that has a double meaning. Putting us on means it actually, it fools us, but it puts us on like a suit of clothes. So it will, in other words, it will offer us this version of ourselves, but from Wetiko, not from our true nature. So it'll offer us, oh, you're wounded, you're traumatized, you're a victim of abuse. And if you then identify with its version of yourself, oh, I'm limited. You see, because being like a dream, as soon as you have an image, a thought form, a belief of who you are, being like a dream, this universe will instantaneously offer you all the evidence confirming your viewpoint in a self-reinforcing feedback loop. Okay. And so if you're not in touch with who you are, the mind virus offers you this limited version. Oh, I'm wounded, traumatized, etc. And then if you're not awake in that moment, you then identify with its version of yourself as being limited. And then it has you. Then it can control you, and it can do this manipulation like you're a puppet on a string. And Jung calls it being the devil's marionette. That's his phrase. And all the while you think you have free will, and you think you're, choosing how to see and how to interpret and how to place meaning on things. And no, at that moment, you've then become an instrument for something other than you, that is not having your best interest at heart, that's actually informing and giving shape to you and your perceptions. Your perceptions are being managed. Your brain is being massaged into place. You've unwittingly offered yourself into the hands of the darker forces. All the while, unconsciously, you're identified with the light and you're projecting out the shadow and seeing the evil out there. So what I just described, I've written 3 books about that very process, because that is actually what I'm describing. This is the sickness, this is the malady that afflicts our species. Okay. But I point out again and again, encoded, hidden within this disease is not only its own cure, but it's actually helping us. It's actually catalyzing our evolution. But it will only do that if we have the recognition of what it's actually revealing to us. Okay. And so to go back to right now, so here in our world, there are people who, like I was saying, good, spiritual, brilliant, well-intentioned. I've never seen anything like this. And they're just asleep in a certain way, lacking curiosity. And this state is contagious. In other words, when a person in that condition, when they meet somebody else who's in a similar condition, they will all of a sudden reinforce each other's unconsciousness as if it's contagious. So then the mind virus is propagating, because this mind virus, it can, we all potentially have it. It exists in the collective unconscious, and it works through the blind spots. So, that's very interesting, because this mind virus is a form of blindness. Okay, but it's a form of blindness. It's a weird form of blindness that doesn't know it's blind. And not only does it not know it's blind, it actually conceives of itself as, oh, I'm more sighted than people who actually see. So the people who are under the propaganda, when somebody who's like snapped out of the propaganda, if that person reflects back, oh, you're actually under the propaganda, the person under the propaganda will think that the person who's free of the propaganda and reflecting to them that they're under the propaganda, they will think the person who's awake is under the propaganda. You see, this is what we're dealing with this mind virus, because it works through the projective tendencies of the mind. And one way of understanding that, I think we've all experienced this, people under the thrall of this mind virus, they accuse other people of doing the very thing that they are unconsciously doing. It's like a mind warp, And so I'm having an imagination that all of us in our own lives can relate to what I'm saying. Doesn't make a difference if you're a Republican, you think, yeah, the Democrats are like that. If you're a Democrat, yeah, the Republicans. It's like, it's pervasive. And what I'm pointing out, being a mind virus, you see, is that, and being like a dream, that difference between the physical realm, the realm of like actual material stuff and seeming things, such as our universe, that world of matter and the world of mind when a person realizes this is a collective dream, and not like that's a metaphor. I remember I had years ago, this eminent Tibetan translator had come over to my house, to meet me, and we were having tea, and we got in sort of like an argument, but it was a very friendly argument. And he was saying, no, 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 it's like a dream, this universe, it's metaphoric. And I was saying, no, 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 there's no metaphor about it at all. This is a dream and nothing other than a dream. And so I'll just give you an example, because what I'm pointing at ultimately is that each one of us as individuals, because it's so easy to feel in this world helpless and powerless. Oh, I'm one of 8 billion, and oh, the darker powers are taking over the world, or our government, or whatever, and I have no power. But the fundamental piece of my work is pointing out that each one of us has unimaginable power. But to the extent that we're unconscious of it, then this mind virus actually plugs into our own unconscious creative energy and turns it against us. Now, I should just make clear something. When I talk about a mind virus, I don't want to have people be scared, because there is no such thing as a mind virus. It doesn't even exist, okay? Separate from our minds. It has no independent intrinsic existence whatsoever, and yet it can kill us. Okay, so that's the paradox. So I don't want to cultivate fear, because the mind virus, its superfood is fear. It feeds off of fear. Okay. And but if people say, oh, well, I'm not going to even think about a mind virus, I'm not going to think about the evil that's playing out in the world. Well, in the collective works, Jung points out this is like if there's a cholera epidemic, and you just say, oh, well, I'm not even going to think about that, then you'll get killed by cholera. And so we're talking about something that's hard to render into language. It both this Wetiko, it both exists and it doesn't exist at the same time. Okay, and it takes a higher form of this logic, instead of two-valued logic where things are true or false. In Buddhism, in quantum physics, and in dreams, there is a higher form of logic, four-valued logic, where things can be A and B, which, even though they're contradictory, simultaneously they can both be true and not true, existing and not existing. And that's that. When you actually cultivate that awareness, that's when you begin to see the mind virus. Okay. Now, part of this, when people see, I'm stunned, being an American, that so many people in our country don't seem to be aware of the extent of the propaganda and of the lies, And part of the propaganda is just like this lying, sort of like an omit by sort of not commission, but omission, that there's stuff that's actually happening that you won't find in all the mainstream media. And it's like our perceptions are really being managed. And I'm amazed how many people don't see that. And of course, part of it is that it takes so much time and energy to do your own research, to try to figure out what actually is happening, and but then how do you navigate where you come up against that edge of somebody who's actually from your point of view propagandized, and yet there's always the possibility that maybe you're propagandized. I mean, I would bet money that every single one of us in this meeting has at certain moments fallen under the spell of whatever, just fill in the blank, of 9/11, or the whole pandemic, or the war in Ukraine, or Putin, or Biden, or Trump. I would bet money, like I'm saying, that every one of us, myself first on the list, have fallen under a particular spell that's being cast. So, and that makes me think that there's a war going on, and not just the war in Ukraine, but there's a war on consciousness going on, and it's really sort of demanding of us to be in touch with our sense making ability, with our discernment, with the ability we have to discern truth from fiction. And of course, this is in the context of here AI, artificial intelligence, is coming more and more onto the scene, where it's becoming more and more impossible to actually at certain moments to tell what is actually true and what is fabricated, what is actually real and what is fiction. And all of this is actually potentially helping us to, the real urgency for each one of us is to get in touch with our true nature, with that stellar nature, with our true self. Now, to give you an example of what I'm pointing out and how profound it is, I want to just describe, to give hopefully even like this living example of what I mean. So if we can invoke the imagination for a second and imagine that you're in a dream, right? And you're in a dream and you're holding a particular perspective in that dream. Now, that dream, any dream, is just this reflection of the mind, right? It's just like you're looking at an ink blot and you're projecting onto the ink blot. And it's not like 1 second, 1 moment you project onto the ink blot a butterfly, and then 3 moments later the butterfly appears. No, the very same instant that you project onto that ink blot, and a dream is nothing other than an ink blot, it's a projection of the mind. The very moment you project onto that ink blot, that very same moment, it doesn't happen over time, it happens in no time, that ink blot will reflect back, giving you all the evidence of your projection. So if you see a butterfly, then there it is in that same moment. And so what happens, so say we're holding a particular point of view in that dream, and then the dream, being nothing other than a projection or reflection of our own mind, just instantaneously, outside of time, will reflect back and offer us all the evidence confirming our viewpoint. Keep in mind, I'm talking about a night dream. Once that happens, now we have evidence confirming the objective truth of our viewpoint. So what happens? We become even more entrenched and more fixed and more convinced in the objective truth of our viewpoint. And the more we do that, the more the dream, being a reflection of our mind, has no option other than just to instantaneously reflect back our viewpoint, confirming, giving us all the evidence we need to confirm the rightness of our viewpoint, which makes us more entrenched and more fixed in our viewpoint ad infinitum, in a self-reinforcing feedback loop in which we entrance ourselves. We have what I just described, we literally have hypnotized ourselves. We have brainwashed ourselves. We have tricked ourselves out of our own right mind via our own creative genius. Okay, what I just described, that's Wetiko. That's the mind virus. Okay, now transpose that to what's happening in the world. People they read the mainstream media or the alternative media too, but there's at least a lot of the alternative media that are independent voices and that are trying to find the truth and are actual authentic investigative journalists, where in the mainstream media, the idea of an investigative reporter is a dying breed. I don't know of anyone that I would call in the mainstream media an authentic investigative journalist, where when we were kids, that was what a lot of the mainstream media were, people who were really trying to report on what's happening and trying to find out the truth. Where unfortunately right now, the mainstream media is bought and sold. It's been captured. And when I'm talking about whether it's the mainstream media or the world, the thing that is so interesting about Wetiko is that it's an inner disease of the soul that has a magical ability to somehow extend itself out into the world and configure events in the outer world so as to synchronistically reflect and express what's going on within the psyche of a person. Okay, so what I'm saying is that what's happening in the outer world, in the body politic of the world, and both in our individual lives, in our minds, in our relationships, and collectively, that's reflecting a process that's happening within the psyche. Okay, so when I just described, oh yeah, the mainstream media has been captured, like a lot of these these agencies, the regulatory agencies that are supposed to monitor against like negative forces or invaders, they've been captured by the very forces they're supposed to monitor. That is reflecting what happens in a human psyche under the thrall of the Wetiko mind virus. Because what'll happen so keep in mind the Wetiko mind virus that exists in potential in the collective unconscious, which is to say we all potentially can fall prey to it at any given moment. I mean, who hasn't acted out their unconscious in their life? We all do. That's part of awakening. Is the problem is if you stay stuck in that and identify, and just in an identified state with that unconscious and don't self-reflect, that's a problem. But just by our nature, we've all fallen asleep and acted out our unconscious. And I want to point out, it's not just that our species has fallen asleep. It's as if there's some sort of this malevolent force within the psyche that's actually invested in keeping us asleep. Because Wetiko, the mind virus, cannot stand to be seen. Because when you see it, you take away its power over you and you empower yourself. So it will do everything it can to make sure that you don't see it. And that's why I can just talk from my own process for a moment. I'm very aware that, I mean, every day there are like these incredible negative forces that are trying to stop me from getting at my work, because I'm like flooding light. I'm actually helping people to see the mind virus that's at the bottom of everything. And I've learned that part of the gig is, oh yeah, there are going to be these like incredibly evil, dark, negative forces that are going to try and stop me. And I've more and more understood, oh, well, that's the best news I've heard all day. That's showing I'm on the right path, instead of thinking, wow, I'm in trouble and I'm really screwed up and all that. No, no, no. The fact that when you actually more connect with your light, of course, it's going to activate the forces, the darker forces. That's their job, is to want to stop you from doing that. But then if you can interpret, oh yeah, well, that's actually a sign that I'm really getting close to something, that's really sort of this way to deal with that. Now, getting back to how what's happening in the outer world is reflecting what's happening in our minds. And I was talking about, here are these regulatory agencies that have been captured both in the world and in our minds, in our psyches. We have these monitoring systems that protect against, our psyche being colonized or taken over or hijacked by the Wetiko mind virus. Well, when you fall under the thrall of Wetiko, those monitoring agencies have gotten captured by the very pathogen that they're supposed to, surveil and monitor. And what happens when the Wetiko mind virus takes someone over, it colonizes the psyche. It subsumes the executive function of the psyche to serve its agenda, which is not in your best interest. This Wetiko mind virus will create a shadow government within the psyche, in your blind spot. You have no idea what's happening. And it'll dictate, like a dictator, to the ego. And more as it like sets up shop within you and it takes you over, that's where it becomes like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Jung talks about this. He says this is one of the most invisible experiences we can ever have. It happens through our blind spots. So the person so taken over is completely oblivious. They oftentimes have never felt more themselves. And they'll be holding the viewpoint of the propaganda, and they feel totally like, I'm the one who's in possession of the truth, because they have endless evidence confirming they're in possession of the truth, because the echo chamber that they're inhabiting of their own mind is continually serving them ongoing evidence confirming that they're in possession of the truth. And so I'm just trying to describe what, not only what's happening when people who are taken over, and I'm really talking about all of us, because unless there's somebody who's really awake, and I also want to put out, I don't think any of us are in a position to actually have a real 100% knowing of what's happening. We can, even somebody who studies a lot of different things, Ukraine and, COVID and the vaccine and Trump and Putin and Biden and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, be careful about feeling I'm in possession of the truth, because I don't think that any of us are in that position to really know. Okay. But what I'm pointing out is that somebody then taken over in that way. Think about what I just described, the shadow government that's dictating to the ego, the regulatory agencies of the psyche being captured. The person doesn't even have any idea of what's happening. That's reflective of what's playing out in our world. That, I'm sure we've all been tracking that totalitarian forces are creeping all over our planet and trying to centralize power and control and turn us all into slaves. And if you think that, oh, that's just a conspiracy theory, I don't want to argue with you, I would just be like, wow, I don't even know what to say to that, and because, and this is really edgy, but in the collected works, Jung again and again and again is pointing out the profound importance of really, how would I say it, just like shedding light on evil. Okay. And what Jung, and keep in mind why I'm quoting Jung, when I described my awakening in 1981, that came out of this direct encounter with archetypal evil. And I was 24-year-old innocent kid who was completely unprepared. And, it destroyed my entire family. It killed my mother. It destroyed my relationship with my mother. We were so close. I haven't had a family for over 20 something years, so I've entailed a great cost of this encounter, but I was fortunate to realize that, oh my God, this is a revelation. Something is being revealed to me. Because what I began to realize, and I won't go into the story, but it was my father. He was in the role of the person who you could say was the abuser. And he was just enacting unconsciously. He was dealing with his own unhealed stuff, like a lot of people do, by just acting it out. He couldn't help himself because he wasn't doing his work. So it was compulsive acting out on the next of kin, and I'm the only child. And I point out in my new book that that's the origin of the mind virus, by the way, of the evil. Like in the collected works, Jung talks about that evil regenerates itself over the generations. Exactly. When we have unhealed multi-generational ancestral trauma, it literally just gets passed down and transmitted through the generations, to the point that the kids who inherit it don't do their work and heal. They're going to be fated to just act it out on their kids, and that's the way this mind virus gets reproduced. And so here's Jung, and why I bring up Jung so much is, after I had my awakening, and then the last hospitalization was 82, and now I was doubly traumatized from the abuse from my father and then from psychiatry. And I began to realize, oh my God, the same evil that was coming through the person of my father, I recognized was coming through this system of psychiatry. It had changed channels. And then I began to recognize that same evil that was coming through the person of my father, through the system of psychiatry, was the same evil that was playing out through the body politic of the world, like it was iterations of a fractal. And so here I was, having this absolute direct encounter with evil, with archetypal evil, not just personal evil, the evil that myths and fairy tales are about. And somehow, for some reason, I was lucky, strong enough, courageous enough, blessed enough, whatever. I have no idea. I mean, from my point of view, I was none of those things. I just didn't have a choice, because all of a sudden I went from being a normal person to not being able to live my life, really, truly. And it just stopped me. And I was going to either jump off a bridge, or I was going to understand what is going on. And I was fortunate that I began to recognize, after years of study and, self-inquiry and being creative and dreaming and all this stuff, I began to understand what was being shown to me. And so the point is going back to Jung, he was pointing again and again. He says stuff like, evil is a great power that's striding across the world stage. We have to come to terms with it, And he actually points out that encoded in evil it actually has, and this is his words, it actually has a special purpose, that it might be helping us to access a part of ourselves that we wouldn't have accessed without it. Okay. That it's actually potentially helping us to awaken. It's helping us to evolve and to actualize our inherent freedom. Okay. And this is very sort of very straight from the Kabbalah. Like Jung, when he discovered the Kabbalah, I mean, his head exploded. He wrote about this. He says, "Oh my God, these guys were talking exactly about what I've been writing about my whole life." Because in the Kabbalah, they talk about that the true light is to be found hidden within the darkest evil. And they talk about the descent on behalf of the ascent. That, in other words, by going down into the darkness of the unconscious, we actually, that's the secret way of ascending. Now, so that's why I continually quote Jung, because more than anybody I've ever come across, he has the deepest understanding. I mean, he struggled his whole life with coming to terms with evil. And when I found his work, I mean, it was a lifesaver to me, because all of a sudden, here's somebody who's speaking my language, who is actually like having had a somewhat of a similar experience in his confrontation with the unconscious. And instead of just being destroyed by it, he actually was able, just like a shaman, he was able to extract some sort of medicine that has helped the world. Now, what Jung says is very, very interesting, because he says that the great problem of our time, and this is a quote, is that we don't know what is happening in our world. And what he means is that what is happening in our world is we are making a descent into the darkness of the soul, into the darkness of the unconscious. These aren't my words. This is Jung's words. Okay. Now it's interesting, because when I spoke, to Ions in Vancouver, it was the last time I spoke. It was literally a month or two before it was in 2020, either in January or February. And it was right before the lockdown. And I was finishing up what has become the biggest chapter in my new book. And it was all about the shamanic archetype. So I was deeply thinking about that, 24/7. And so the talk I gave that last time I was here was all about, we as a species are making a shamanic descent into the underworld, and it involves a death, rebirth, and, a descent, like a confrontation with darkness, and, and with insanity and with death and all that. And then, like, within a month or so, all of a sudden, the pandemic happened. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't realize how prescient I was being. Because I want to point out that the sort of, in my opinion, that the number one archetype, or I would say, well, one of the top archetypes that's activated in the collective unconscious is the shamanic archetype. Okay. And that archetype is really, really interesting. And this has to do with when you encounter people who, not just the invasion of the body snatchers, it's also their minds have been snatched. Because think about what Jung is saying. Yeah, our species is possessed, and what happens when one becomes possessed, and we all become possessed at certain moments in time where we're just, like a robot, we're just, acting out our programming, our conditioning. Who hasn't done that? And part of what happens is that something that's really not us, then say we actually become fixed in a viewpoint. We've read like the mainstream media, we've gotten propagandized in a way we wouldn't even imagine we would, because of the all pervasiveness of the propaganda. And if we read something, we go to a fact checker, which is itself, that's funded by the very darker forces that are funding it's unbelievable. And then at a certain point, we parrot the very point of view that the powers that be that are behind all the evil that's playing out in the world right now, we actually parrot the very point of view that they want us to think. You see, because one of the things that's really important that I've noticed, it has to do with like, where is the evil? Because, so if people are projecting the evil and projecting the shadow, which by the way, in the collected works, Jung calls projecting the shadow the lie. Okay, interesting. Who is the liar? In the Bible, it's the devil. The point is there's an equivalency between projecting the shadow and evil. Okay, so if we're projecting the shadow and seeing, oh, the evil is out there, the evil, whoever, just fill in the blank. And how I know this so well, that's what happened to me in my family, that my father dealt with his evil by projecting it onto me. And, in projections, even though they're not like something that has weight or, it's not a palpable thing you could measure, but it's a particular energy that really affects us. When somebody projects the shadow on us, it can make us sick. This is the essence of black magic. And so if we're all busy falling under the propaganda and projecting the shadow onto whoever, oh, Biden or Trump or Putin or this or that or, whatever, yeah, there might be truth to that. But if we're projecting the shadow, we then are identified, oh, I'm righteous and I'm all good and I'm light. And then by projecting the shadow, we're unwittingly feeding Wetiko, we're unwittingly feeding the forces of darkness. So that's why one of the things I'm pointing out is to really try and to find, okay, there's evil playing out in our world. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But then what is the source of that? And yeah, ultimately the source is our own mind, is our ignorance, is our blindness. Okay, sure. But that only tells us so much. I'm talking about, instead of just having a convenient scapegoat, to actually really try and see, if you're interested, if you have enough energy to do this, okay, there's evil that's playing out in our world, like Jung is saying, it's striding across the world stage. It's this world power. Okay, to just really try to, understand what is actually happening and not just to fall under a limited viewpoint. Because when we project a shadow, oh, say Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi or Putin or this guy or that guy or whatever, then we foreclosed on our curiosity and we foreclosed on our self-inquiry. So I can tell when I talk to somebody politically where they're at in their spiritual practice, because I can see, oh, have they reached premature conclusions where they're not in any position to know that, they've drank the Kool-Aid. That to me is a reflection of their own spiritual evolvement or lack thereof. Okay. And so what I'm pointing out is that when you see other people, and some of them are best friends or partners or kids or parents who are under the propaganda, what I've noticed is that as I see that, and I've quickly figured out, okay, there's a don't go there zone, a no-fly zone. I better not say anything. I better not give them any evidence that contradicts their viewpoint. But I actually can more and more develop the eyes to see what's happening with them. Oh my God, they've just gotten fixed in a viewpoint. They have no curiosity. Think they're in possession of the truth. They feel threatened by any contradictory viewpoint. That itself is incredible medicine for me to see that, because that's helping me to inoculate myself and to understand how that's the way this mind virus works. Because it's contagious, it propagates through the unconscious blind spots. So when you have like a group of people who all have the same point of view, they're all like convinced, oh, we're in possession of the truth, whatever that point of view is, whether it's spiritual or political or whatever, they're unwittingly reinforcing each other's blindness. Because keep in mind what Wetiko is, it's a collective psychosis. And that's what again and again, Jung was warning the greatest danger that faces our species is to fall into a psychic epidemic, into a collective psychosis, you know? And he also talks about, and I quote this, I think in my new article, he talks about the great mistake that people make. Okay, the great mistake, and what it is to identify what he calls the fictitious personality, or he also calls it the artificial self. Think about what I described, how the covert operations of Wetiko, it offers us a fictitious identity. It impersonates us. It's like this mime, a master mime. It will ape us, but in its limited version, and then we identify with its version. That's the great mistake, you know? And when you get enough people who have fallen under that great mistake and are identifying themselves as being a skin encapsulated ego, a separate self, then what happens, the other half of that process, is you then think that the world out there is separate from you. As a separate self, you think, oh, the world out there is objective. And the more you think the world out there is objective, that reinforces the sense of being a separate self. And the more you think of yourself as a separate self, you think of the world out there as being objective. They reciprocally co-arise and reinforce and condition each other. That's the illusion. I mean, that's, you know, talking a way deeper level than just politically, but that's actually what I'm trying to help people to see through that illusion. Because that illusion of thinking that we exist in a way that we don't, thinking that we exist as a separate self, and thereby other people exist as separate selves, and the universe exists out there, objective, separate from us, that's the scientific materialist point of view. And that's what quantum physics, that's why I have a book I wrote on quantum physics, and I point out that quantum physics is offering the medicine for the malady that afflicts our species, for this mind virus. Because quantum physics is saying that not only does this world that we've been envisioning before quantum physics came along, we were entranced thinking this world objectively existed, and we were just studying it, trying to understand it. Quantum physics, by showing that the act of observation actually influences the universe observed, and I should point out, that's a description of a dream. Quantum physics has empirically proven that we're having a collective dream, but most quantum physicists aren't trained to understand. You see, here's the thing, quantum physics, I don't know anybody who disagrees. It's, you know, it's accepted. It's the greatest discovery ever in all of history in the realm of science. But what the controversy is what does it mean? Now, I'm not a physicist at all. I'm just a curious person. But that world I snapped into in 1981, that parallel world where I had a quantum jump, once I became aware of quantum physics and I began to realize, wait a second, they're describing exactly the world that I'm inhabiting now. So that's why I became so interested in it. So here, quantum physics has proven that, oh yeah, there's no such thing as an objective world. There's no correlate to an objective world in reality. The idea of an objective world is just that, an idea in your head, okay? That the act of observing the universe actually influences it, which is the description of a dream, which is to say the act of observation is creative. You see, we have this enormous creative power. It's like we're holding this magic quantum object that fell through down from the heavens, but a lot of us don't even know where we have it. We already are in possession of it, but we don't know how to use it. Okay, that's what I'm trying to point out, that to the extent that we take in this gnosis that quantum physics is revealing to us, in other words, that the act of observation is creative, that we have this unimaginably vast creative power by the way we interpret the inkblot of reality, the waking dream, and how we place meaning on it, then all of a sudden we become empowered agents. Because quantum physics is pointing out we are literally creating our experience moment by moment. There's no one else doing that. We are creating our experience of both ourselves and of the world. And if we're not conscious of that, then we feel victimized. Then we outsource our own creative power, and the powers that be, then we experience, they're creating our experience for us. But when we actually awaken to our intrinsic nature, to our stellar nature, part of that realization is, oh my God, I have this enormous power. We all do. This is what Christ was saying in the Bible when he says, ye are gods. And he also says the very next words, and scripture cannot be broken. Okay. So he was pointing at that it's fated, that at a certain point in history, that we, enough of us, are going to awaken, to this divine power that we have, that we interface with the divine. And particularly when we come together with other people who are also awakening to that intrinsic divine power, that's when we can come together and actually change the world. And this isn't theory. This is what quantum physics is totally saying. Quantum physics was trying to find what is the essence of this physical universe. What are the building blocks? What is the microstructure? And as it went down and down more and more, into smaller levels of scale, it didn't find anything physical. It found that consciousness was at the bottom of this universe. Or another way of saying that is that they coined this term like, elementary particles. And an elementary particle is really interesting. Wait, hold on. I'm just going to take out one of my contacts, or maybe I won't. It just got dry for a moment. I have hard contact lenses and they can get dry. But these elementary particles, they exist in a state of potentiality, like any and every potential state they could ever exist in. They exist until the moment of observation, and then they actualize into one particular state. And that process and all the other potential states just vaporize into parallel universes. And then each and every moment, that's the scenario where like the quantum elementary particle exists in all the potential states that could ever exist in, moment by moment. And then by our observation, and keep in mind, I mean, then who's the observer? Is it just humans, or what about other sentient species, or what about immaterial beings? I mean, it's a very open-ended question, but there's something about the act of observation, of perceiving, that's actually it's a variable in the equation of the universe, instead of just being, oh, it's unimportant and we're just observing an objective universe. No, the act of observation is a key part of the very universe we're observing. But quantum physics says, even if one of those potentialities of that quantum elementary particle is highly, ridiculously, and this is a quote, unlikely, it could be the very state that manifests this very moment. Okay. Now, just if you think about that, and let's bring it into real life, what that means is that the fact that our species could actually awaken in time to avert the myriad catastrophes that we are creating, no one is doing that to us. We are literally creating so many different ways of taking ourselves out as a species and destroying ourselves. And yet, here's quantum physics saying, oh, when it's easy to get into despair and pessimism, and as soon as you get locked in that viewpoint, being like a dream, you're just going to attract all the evidence confirming your pessimism in a self-perpetuating feedback loop, and then you're part of the problem. Okay. But if you actually, what quantum physics is saying is that, no, we actually have the ability. It's within the realm of possibility that we can wake up, and that could even start with you, because Jung is saying it has to start with the individual. And think about it, the image he uses is like you have a glass of water, you dissolve sugar in the water, each grain dissolves and dissolves and dissolves until the saturation point is reached, and then a crystal will spontaneously manifest. He says that's a way of understanding the formation of symbols in the unconscious. That's also a way of understanding if one of us in this moment wakes up to the dreamlike nature, sees their shadow, has the recognition of the mind virus, however you say it, all different ways of pointing at the same thing. Us doing that one person doing that might be that grain of sugar that catalyzes an awakening in the collective unconscious of our species. Okay. So I would say, if we're not envisioning that we as a species, because I think we all intuit there's incredible darkness happening And encoded in the darkness, there's some potential like light or some potential like positivity. Like more and more people are waking up. It's like, think of it like the alchemical vessel, the psyche of humanity. There's incredible pressure in the alchemical vessel of our species. And once again, like in the collective works, Jung points out in an individual person's process, so often it's right when they're at the edge of the cliff or in the corner or double bound, that's when they become lucid. Okay. And I'm wondering about whether that same dynamic is at work collectively, that we as a species are right at that edge of a cliff. It looks inevitable that we're destroying ourselves. There's incredible pressure in the alchemical vessel. And yet that's the very state that, any one of us could potentially wake up and become lucid. Okay. Now, what Jung also says, which is interesting, and this really has to do with our topic, he talks about the sickness of our time. And what does he call the sickness of our time? He says it is a sickness of dissociation, where the right hand does not know what the left hand is doing. And, if you think about it, when people who are under the propaganda, they're having a one-sided viewpoint, right? In a two-sided world, or even more than two-sided. But they're fixed in their viewpoint. They become ossified, rigidified. They have a psychic myopia. They're only seeing through a particular lens, and it's a particular lens that draws evidence confirming the rightness of its viewpoint. And they're actually colluding and putting themselves under the spell, and they have no idea that they're under a spell or that they're complicit, that they're the ones who are participating in doing that. And it's an extraordinary sort of like situation. So this sickness of dissociation, he's basically saying that that's a way of describing the affliction that our species is suffering from. But he goes, from another point of view, this is actually a pregnancy, that something is actually being birthed through. And he also talks about through the transition of like, one age, one epoch into another. And I think a lot of us know we're going into the age of Aquarius, whatever that means. But there definitely seems to be a transition, that the way we have been doing business together, let's put it that way, has not been working for for all of us, which means for any of us, ultimately that's not going to work. That there's something that is I think we all know, it's like there's no avoiding. It's like everybody I know has their shadow right in their face, and a lot of us have been postponing, I'll get to it mañana, and it's like there's no more avoiding coming to terms with our own shadow. And our own shadow, there's a personal aspect, and then there's the collective aspect. And another way of describing what's happening is that we're a species in trauma, and trauma is a form of madness, but it's actually a very interesting form of madness, because it's the most sane response to an insane situation. Okay, so if somebody takes a bone and they break the bone isn't pathological because it broke. No, but there was like too much pressure. So it was like the healthy thing for the bone to break. In the same way, I mean, I've been screaming for years, oh my God, I'm in total trauma. And I'm talking about from what happened with my father, but people didn't understand, and no one saw that. And but the thing which is also interesting about trauma, and this helps us to understand what's happening in our world, is that encoded in trauma, like when we're in trauma, the way we try to heal from the trauma unwittingly creates the trauma we're trying to heal from in a self-generating feedback loop. That just can go on forever. And that's the pathology of trauma, right? That's why it's an illness. But what I'm pointing out is that encoded in that acting out of our trauma, we're actually trying to discharge something. We're actually trying to integrate and heal. One way of understanding trauma, think about it like it's unexperienced experience. Like when we first got traumatized, by definition, it's an overwhelming experience that we couldn't integrate. It was too much. So we split, we disassociate. Remember, the sickness of our time is a sickness of disassociation. We are all in trauma. Okay. And so at that moment of the historical trauma, we split, which has double meaning, which means we split in two, and split means to leave. Right. And, and this reminds me, and I'll get right back to the trauma thing in a second, I promise, when somebody is taken over by the propaganda, in the article I wrote, and it's on my website, you can see it, the invasion of the body snatchers thing, there's a quote of Jung. He talks about, then people become like hollowed out, like psychic termites, have hollowed them out, and they become vacant, like there's no one home. They're just spouting the algorithm. And that algorithm, the mainstream media propaganda, is coming out of millions of people's mouths. So then the fact that, that a lot of people believe it, that must be evidence that it's really true. And so it just propagates itself. Okay. Now, but the point I wanted to make is that when people have gotten taken over by the propaganda, they, in a sense, aren't there. They become an instrument through which they become a mouthpiece through which something else is coming through them. And they have no idea of what's actually happening. So getting back to trauma, by its definition, it's an overwhelming experience. The person dissociates. Now, interestingly, one of the things that can happen in trauma is that split off part, if you don't deal with it and integrate it, it develops an autonomy and a seeming independence of its own. And in psychology speak, this is called an autonomous complex. And this autonomous complex, what the indigenous people would call that, they would say, oh, that's a demon. That's what they call a demon. Okay. And that autonomous complex, which has a seemingly, we subjectively experience it as some alien other inside of us that's adversarial, that has an independent seeming will and life of its own, the counterforce to like what we want to do in our lives, there's like this inner adversarial force. That's Wetiko. Okay. Now, that idea of being traumatized, and trauma is unexperienced experience because we weren't able to consciously experience it at the moment of the trauma because it was overwhelming. We couldn't creatively symbolize it and express the trauma because it was overwhelming. So then what happens, we get compelled to enact it. And that's the pathology. We're continually re-traumatizing ourselves, and I can't help but do it. It's compulsive, right? But I would point out, encoded in that, and this is actually at the root of addiction too. See, Wetiko is at the root of trauma, addiction, of the insanity that's happening out in the world, of each of our insanity, of all the problems we're having in a relationship. That's why I'm writing book after book about it. In the Castaneda books, I think you probably all know them, Carlos's teacher, this great shaman, he didn't have the word Wetiko. He called it predator. He says, this is the topic of topics. There is nothing more important than this. And I continually try to point that out, and I'm not being melodramatic or exaggerating. If we don't recognize Wetiko is it's a revelation. It's actually showing us the profound primary importance of the human psyche in creating world events. It is literally demanding that we plug into our divine inheritance and use it in a way that's productive. It's actually showing us the dreamlike nature. But if we don't recognize its revelatory aspect, it will kill us. You see, Wetiko is a quantum phenomena. Just like is light a wave or a particle? Well, it's both, depending on how it's observed. Will Wetiko kill us and take us down, or will it awaken us? It depends on how we dream it. It's a revelation. And if we recognize what it's revealing, then we get the benefits of the revelation. We have to participate in the revelation. We have to open our eyes and see and recognize what's being offered to us. And if we don't, we're doomed. Okay. So getting back to trauma, just to close that loop, it's unexperienced experience. So it's as if we are trying to consciously experience something that we weren't able to consciously experience at the moment of trauma, so as to liberate that energy that has been chronically invested in re-traumatizing ourselves, all of a sudden that energy becomes available for expressing ourselves creatively and for love and for compassion. Okay. And just one final word about compassion, and then I'll open it up for questions and hopefully answers. But I point out in my work that the real medicine for this mind virus, for what's afflicting people when they're taken over, when they unwittingly become these instruments of the propaganda and they're just parroting, the mainstream line, and they're just spouting the algorithm, you know. So on the one hand, there's no arguing with them, there's no giving them evidence or facts. But on one thing you can do is to recognize, oh, they're a dream character. And what does that mean? A dream character is a reflection of a part of you. So they are embodying this asleep part of you. And if you can cultivate compassion in that moment for them, for yourself, for everyone, compassion is the dissolver, the Wetiko dissolver par excellence. So I would just say in conclusion that like just getting back to Jung for a second, he says more than anything, this time in history, we need self-reflection. And he talks about that by any one of us self-reflecting, that individuation is incarnation, is his quote. That by any of us awakening to whatever degree we do, we actually become the incarnation of the deity. It incarnates through us. Okay. And so compassion, self-reflection, having the recognition of our nature, and being creative, because creative is our nature. We are made in the image of our creator. In my new book, there's a Russian philosopher, Nicholas Berdyaev or Berdyaev. You see, because I'm like a self-taught, I never have taken classes in any of this stuff. So a lot of these people are names I don't even know how to actually pronounce them. But he's an amazing philosopher. There's a chapter in the book where he's very into theology and God, and he says he's all about the second coming. And he says, oh, but the second coming, if we are just passively waiting for the second coming, we will only see the crucified face of Christ. But if we actually step into our creative nature, then by us doing that and expressing ourselves creatively, we are offering ourselves to be an instrument for the second coming. Okay. And just one final thing, because I think you guys get a sense I can just talk forever about this, because this is just not only is my work, it's what I think about all day. And in the book, there's also a chapter. I don't know if people know the great clairvoyant Rudolf Steiner. And Steiner, he actually he talks about the most momentous event happening in this time in history is what he calls the incarnation of the etheric Christ. That Christ isn't incarnating in human form like he did 2000, in Jesus 2000 years ago. But he's incarnating through all of humanity, and we are tainted with the shadow, whereas Christ was kept all pure and light. And then interestingly, right at the moment that Christ appeared on the scene, who else appeared? Satan. It was as if the opposites were totally polarized. And, that's an expression of the polarization in the collective psyche at the time of Christ. Whereas now, God, or whatever you call it, the self, is incarnating through creaturely humanity. And we all have shadows. And so as God, and this is Jung, this isn't me, as God gets closer to encountering humanity, to all of us through the collective unconscious that we all share, closer and closer comes an encounter with evil. And what Steiner is saying is that the greatest event, like I'm saying, the momentous event in our time is the incarnation of the etheric Christ. But he goes, before that can be actualized, we have to encounter, in his words, the beast. And the beast is radical evil. And that's what we are in the middle of. It's the darkness of the soul, the darkness of the unconscious. And it's actually this revelation showing us not only our own darkness, because like Jung says, any one of us could be a criminal, a murderer. We all, under the right circumstances. But the more we actually own our shadow, not just intellectually, not just as an idea, it's a moral problem. It affects us in the core of our souls. The more we own our deepest, darkest shadows, not just personally, but collectively, the more we actually realize our light. Okay, because we're a conjunction of opposites, as is God, and or whatever you call it, the self. You don't even have to get into religious language. So, anyways, that's my talk for tonight, and I'm happy to open it up. And I'm really curious of if there are any questions.
I'm going to go ahead and put it on the speaker or the gallery view so everybody can see everybody. So when you ask a question, we can see you. So if you have a question, why don't you do the little raise hand icon down at the bottom so we can see who wants to talk. And Paul, do you want to call on people or do you want me to do that?
Oh, yeah, no. What about you, Dottie? That would be fine.
Okay. Okay, who has the first question? Or comment or... Don't all speak at once.
Milt has his hand up, Dottie.
Oh, thank you. I can see the hand up there. Hi, Milt. Go
Hi.
ahead.
Hi, Paul. Thank you very much for your insights and actually just being as alive as you have of taking on a system really that couldn't cope with you. And so it's pretty amazing. I just been working with a concept of complex adaptive systems, where I look at the indigenous people several thousand years ago, where I believe humankind was as developed then as they are now, and they lived in the complex adaptive system that was basically modeled by nature, and it was extremely adaptive. I felt not very complex, but extremely adaptive. And then when humankind separated from that 4,000 to 6,000 years ago and entered into empire, that whole empire complex adaptive system just got more and more and more complex until we are where we are today. And in large part because we don't have a language that opens up the understanding of the quantum world that you described. Whereas I think those people who were connected to nature all had a language that opened up that understanding, and they developed an intuition. They didn't call it quantum physics or talk about it as quantum physics the way we do, but it was an understanding of the quantum world, I felt. So I just wanted to say that to you and see, is that tuned in to where you are at all? Or
Yeah. Well, no, I think it is. I mean, maybe we can agree to disagree, because I think that humanity and consciousness has evolved over the centuries. But I also agree that whether you say indigenous people or in my quantum physics book, I point out that the realizations that the quantum physicists were having were exactly the realizations that the Buddha had. It was like he realized the quantum, and he put it in the language of his time. But there's an incredible equivalency between what the Buddha was saying, because what was he saying? He was saying, oh, this is a dream, in essence, which is what the real switched on quantum physicists are saying. And so, yeah, it's almost like we're like sort of, instead of having like amnesia, there's a word anamnesia, where it's an unforgetting. We're unforgetting. We're like having this remembering, like, putting our members back together. When I was talking about going, in like the shamanic trip, It's like we're retrieving our soul, because in a sense, what is happening in our world with, all the craziness and the evil and the scientific materialist it's really a battle for the human soul, and people who get taken over by this mind virus or get, put under the spell of the propaganda, in a way, it's like they're not human being anymore. Like in indigenous cultures, when somebody really becomes enlightened, what are they called? They're called, oh, they've attained the status of a human being, and that's why it's so important for us to be in touch with our humanity, to be in touch with our heart, with our soul, with our love, with our compassion, with our creativity, because that's what it is to be human. Particularly now with AI and, with transhumanism, and they're wanting to make us part machine, and it's just insane. And, and I keep on pointing out, don't underestimate the nuclear power of compassion, because from one point of view, things seem really dire and dark. And if I could just do like one more association, I subjectively, this is a personal confession, I keep on having an experience like we've been here before, almost like we're having a recurring dream. Because think about it, here dreams are compensations. If we're one-sided, our unconscious creates symbols and creates a dream and tries to get us back in balance, depending, of course, if we get into alignment with the symbol, right? And and if we don't get the message of the dream, what happens? We then have a recurring dream, and it might get even more amplified and more dire until we finally get the message, and then the recurring dream doesn't happen anymore. And so I feel like we're having a recurring dream, and we've been here a million times before, and we've blown ourselves up. And then it takes whatever 14 billion years or whatever to regenerate and get right back to the same moment, which in dream time is no time at all. And then we blow ourselves up again, and it happens again and again and again. And I'm just wondering whether, maybe this is the time that enough of us wake up. And when any of us wake up sufficiently, and of course, it's an endless process, and we connect with other people who are awakening, that becomes contagious. And we can, in a way, what I call dream ourselves awake, which is completely evolutionary, because that's to realize we can consciously step into participating in our own evolution, and we can activate the genius, the collective genius of, the people who are awakening, which is our species. And we can do that in a way where we can dream a different dream. And that's completely, totally, 100% within the realm of possibility. So I'm just putting that out, hopefully to dispel any pessimism that all of, that is potentially in the air because things look so dark, and to inspire people that we, I think all of us have these visions of what potentially can happen. And, instead of just, that's just your imagination, get real. No, I just want to point out, Jung he literally said this, the greatest discovery of the 20th century in the realm of psychology was what he calls the reality of the psyche. That the psyche was a real thing, that it's not objective, like we think of stuff as being objective, separate from us, but it's not just merely subjective. It somehow couples the objective and the subjective. That's the realm of the quantum. That's the realm of shamans and dreamers, people who have visions. And he's talking about that the psyche is real. It actually works. It actually not only has an influence on us, it's literally creating our experience. And he's saying the psyche isn't just in our skulls. No, we are in the psyche. This is a dream. And it's all a question of if we recognize that. And then once we recognize that, to stabilize that realization, this is spiritual practice. So I'm actually going off. I'm going on a tangent, but I'm just really putting out the thought form that, we can come together in a way and get in sync and get in phase where we can activate our, like I'm saying, our collective genius, and we could conspire to co-inspire each other. That's a real conspiracy theory. And that's why I've actually, years ago, I created this art happening. It's still in progress. It's an art happening called Global Awakening, where, there's such incredible pressure in the alchemical vessel of humanity that more and more of us are awakening. And then you realize it's not a competitive sport. No, we can help each other awaken, and we can come together. And that's what's being offered to us. And if we don't do that due to lack of courage or whatever reason, then we're doomed. I mean, really. Yeah. So thank you.
Sherry?
Yeah, I couldn't figure out how to find the little hand that I raised. It never stayed. So, well, I love this whole discussion. And you said the number one defense is to be in touch with who we really are.
Right.
And so, Paul, I want to know, how do I know I'm in touch with who I really am when there's so much illusion and disillusion and
Right.
whatever in the world?
Right. No, that's like a great question. I really appreciate that. And I'm not sure, even how to answer that, but I'll tell you what fell in my head. And of course, the question, where did it fall in my head from? Anyways, but that's just kind of an interesting thing. So I'm a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner. You can see behind me is a little shrine. And I've been doing, I've been really fortunate in that I'm very close with some of the greatest of the lamas, the, spiritual teachers, like I met them right soon after getting out of the hospital, and they also saved my life. And so I'm going to answer it from the Buddhist point of view. And they talk about, so what they do in their tradition, and they're the lineage holders of, it's considered in Tibetan Buddhism to be the most advanced, highest tradition. It's also the simplest, in that there's nothing to do, there's nothing to transform, there's nothing you need to liberate, you don't need to exercise anything. The only thing you need to do is the teacher points out your nature until you actually have the recognition. And then you just don't forget. Then you just don't get distracted. One morning I was having breakfast with one of my teachers, and he says, yeah, my whole practice, Paul, is just to not get distracted, So he's had the recognition of his nature, and he just is abiding in and as that. Well, then the question is, well, what do you mean? What is his nature? And in Buddhism, they have two symbols that really transmit that. And one is, they say like space, like there's no edges, there's no, circumference, there's no center, it's omnipresent, it's everywhere, and it has this room for everything. And think about the darkest thunderclouds. It has room for that, and it doesn't taint or stain space. Space is, in a way, of a higher dimension than any of the objects that appear in it, any of the planets, the stars, the clouds, whatever. It has room for all of it, and it's never tainted or stained, never affected. It's always the same. It's always present. That's like our nature. Okay, that's one metaphor or symbol. The other is like this mirror. When you have a mirror, now think about it. Now in alchemy, they talk about the philosopher's stone as being invisible, which is very interesting. If there is no object with a mirror, the mirror is invisible, right? Now, but then you have an object, and the mirror just reflects in the object. And so here we come in and we see the reflection. Think about the reflection in that mirror as like a thought form. Moment by moment, we're having thoughts, right? If we identify with a thought form, or think about like with a reflection, we're looking at that mirror, there's the reflection. If we think that reflection is real, if we react to the reflection, if we contract against it, if we judge it, if we identify with it, all of those things, we then, in Buddhist terms, we've entered into samsara, the endless suffering, the endless cycle of death and rebirth. But if we actually have the recognition of the mirror that underlies the reflections, and that mirror is never tainted or stained by the reflection, that mirror is always there, it's always the same, it's always accessible, and the reflection, which seems to be obscuring the mirror, is actually revealing the mirror. So they talk about our mirror-like nature. that our true nature is like a mirror. So then, you know, to answer your question, yeah, it's always like a smart thing to be like, oh, I feel like I know my true nature. Well, how do you know that you're not fooling yourself? I mean, I get that. So that's where, you know, I mean, I think about like these great lamas, and they're always talking about, oh, I'm continually increasing my altruism, you know, because you don't ever get to the end point. You're always just opening. You see, the key thing in this tradition that I do practice, it's called the precious bodhicitta. And bodhicitta means the awakened heart. It really, His Holiness Dalai Lama calls it the good heart. And our nature is to be love and have love and compassion. And so, you know, if you're really in touch with yourself, you're really, one way of checking is, oh, do I have a heart that's filled with love, that's overflowing with love, that's overflowing with compassion, you know? And the thing about love and compassion, which is so interesting, is that the more we share it, the more there is to share. It's not a zero, so whatever. It's not a like a, what's that, like 0-1 game where it's like a limited amount. No, it's like it's endlessly just replenishes itself. And of course, I would also say count on reflections from people close to you, you know, because one of the etymology of mirror, the word mirror, literally means the holder of the shadow. Okay, so particularly people that we're closest to and we have the most love for, they're going to be reflecting our shadow. You see, and it's one thing if I'm just by myself and I have insight into my shadow, very quickly that can turn into an idea of my shadow and not be a real genuine confrontation with my shadow. But if I'm acting out my shadow with you and you see my shadow and I see, oh no, you're seeing my shadow, that's a totally different experience. Then all of a sudden something deep within my psyche registers. So you see, because one of the ways that Wetiko works out, or the main way, is in relationships. You know, just all of a sudden, think about what we were talking about tonight with the propaganda. Somebody will have a different viewpoint and it can end a friendship. It can end a marriage, you know? And so the idea of just continually self-reflecting, you know, oh yeah, I'm having this judgment, I'm solidifying this person. Oh, really? Okay. Well, what if you're looking in a mirror? What if you're irritated or annoyed because of their actually reflecting something in you? So it's like an endless thing, but it doesn't have to be work. I mean, just honestly, you know, my best friend who I talk to every day, we spend hours just tripping out over what's happening in the world and unfolding it symbolically. And when I say symbolically, once again, this is Jung. He fought his whole life for to institute symbolic awareness. And symbols are the language of dreams. And this being a dream is an oracle. It's continually this revelation. It's speaking to us, but we're not fluent in the language, which is dreaming, you know? So it's like an endless thing. And I just love that question, because if somebody says to me, oh, I'm enlightened, I know my nature, I run the other way, you know? Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you. Victoria, I see you have a question.
Well, that actually is very interesting, Paul, because I had this question, I think, before the last two questions, and I feel like you have answered it. But what my question was, I really appreciated your emphasis on compassion, and was wondering how you personally, or if you could talk about how you personally maybe use that to help yourself stay awake or stay able to see past the propaganda, to not get caught up in the,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And, you know, it's one of my practice. I continually, I mean, you know, I've had these incredible dreams, these lucid dreams, where as soon as I would become lucid, spontaneously, I would start chanting Om Mani Padme Hum, the mantra of compassion. This was even before I even started basically doing practice. I mean, a long time ago. And, you know, and it's interesting in Buddhism, they say if it's real awakening, it's always the co-joining of two factors of emptiness and compassion. And Om Mani Padme Hum, that's the mantra of compassion. And emptiness is becoming lucid, is recognizing the world isn't independent or intrinsically existing from its own side, you know. And so on the one hand, you know, I really, you know, and I feel like I'm such a beginner because I get triggered, I get into judgment, I react, and, you know, great, I have a lot of stuff to work on, like, as do we all. But another thing that I've developed, and I think of my best friend who I was just mentioning, we've developed sort of an aesthetic or a capability where continually, like, going down the rabbit hole of when there's something that's evil playing out, instead of, I know so many people who like, no, I can't deal with that, it gets me too depressed or too, you know, freaked out or scared. We've developed an ability to just know, we want to more understand that, and let's go into that and see what's happening, and, you know, see what it can teach us. So instead of just getting edged out or, you know, it being overwhelming. And the image I have when my teachers, these great lamas, would come and visit me in Portland, you know, they'd be super busy teaching, but if they had time, they would love to watch the news, the national news. And there they would be with their prayer beads in their hands, looking at the TV and hearing all the horrors of what's happening. And they're just doing their prayers, you know. And that to me is a real model or a symbol of what I aspire to, you know. And because, you know, I mean, I live in Portland, and one of the biggest New Age bookstores in the world is in my neighborhood, and they won't even carry my books on Wetiko. You know, and they all know me, and I've been on the faculty, and I donated money to them for the pandemic, and yet you go in there, you can't get my books in Wetiko because they're love and light. They're like, oh, we don't want to bring any books in that talk about evil, you know. And, you know, I would love to point out to them, oh, that perspective, that you're unwittingly offering yourselves into the hands of evil by avoiding a relationship with that, you know. So the idea is, you know, to sort of open your eyes to see, oh yeah, there is darkness playing out, and it's reflecting the darkness in me. But what you don't want to do is become overly fascinated by it. That feeds evil. You don't want to turn a blind eye. That feeds evil. But once you see how Wetiko works out, how it operates covertly in the world and in your minds and in your reactions, then all of a sudden, now that you see it as a sovereign being, you can say, hey, I see you, and now I'm choosing where I place my attention, and I'm placing my attention on creating the world I want to live in. And that's kryptonite to Wetiko. So, you know, Bush, I can't say enough about compassion. I talk about that a lot in my work because it's the very thing. I mean, you know, what my father enacted on to me was criminal. It was like, it was just totally evil what he played out. And he kept on doubling down the more I tried to process with him. And so he's been actually a real gift for me to cultivate compassion for that figure. And, you know, so that you know, that's my daily practice. I really try my best, you know, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one.
I'll ask a quick question. Oh,
Go ahead.
yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to
Yeah,
ask you,
yeah.
Paul.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sita Davatilla. I was going to ask you about discernment, because I feel like often we kind of get wrapped up in these, you know, rabbit holes of questioning and inner questioning. And I was going to ask you if you have any tools for discernment today.
Yeah, and I think in my first Wetiko book, Dispelling Wetiko, there's a section on discernment, on the incredible importance of discernment, because Wetiko, it disables our discernment. And then we're not able to distinguish, you know. And of course, the best way, I'll just connect this in a tangential way. The best way to deal with the darkness that's playing out in the world is to know the darkness in yourself. Okay. And the best way to develop discernment for what's happening in the world is to develop discernment on what's happening in your own mind, and just to discern, you know, what part of it is the counterfeiting spirit just impersonating you, and what part of it is actually, oh, this is me. I imagine, because I've had this experience where all of a sudden I'll have a particular point of view, And then I'll like reflect on it and go, wait a second, that's not how I think. It's like I've taken on somebody else's perspective, and then I've been able to distinguish myself from it, you know. And you know, and if I can just say one more thing, because I know we have to close, the idea, this is how like to really deal with like darkness. And this is not me, this is Jung. He talks about the importance of personifying. Remember those autonomous complexes, the split off parts of the psyche, to personify them. And he goes, this isn't hard to do because they naturally personify themselves because they're split off. And then so to objectify them, because when you objectify them, you distinguish yourself from them. And that's a sense of discernment. Oh, that's out there and this is me, which is very different than just being unconsciously fused and identified. Then your discernment is out the window. And when your inner discernment is out the window, how are you going to be able to discern what's actually true and not true in propaganda and all that? You're not going to be able to. So I would just say, you know, the discernment is profoundly important. And it's something that we just need to cultivate and cultivate within ourselves. Just like if we're really aware of the darkness within ourselves, then we'll way more be able to deal with the darkness in the world. Yeah, so thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul. I really appreciate your coming tonight and giving us your presentation. It's very interesting. You know, it's interesting to me how it dovetails with some other things, you know, the gene keys and some of the other things that are happening in the world that people are bringing forth to help us do exactly this, to get discernment, to wake up, to see how we're contributing and how we can heal ourselves from Wetiko. So thank you, and thank you, everybody. It's great to see you all tonight, and there will be the recording, and those of you who weren't on our list, Paul will send it out to you, the link to the YouTube recording. So thank you, everybody.
Great.
Have a great
Thank you,
week
everyone.
or a great month. We'll see you next month. Thanks again, Paul. Great,
Yeah, thank you.
great
Okay,
presentation.
bye-bye.
Good,
Bye.
Paul. Thank you, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.